Let's talk about Prot Paladin in the War Within. With the recent talent changes that we here like to call reworks, also the hero talents, how it actually plays in the War Within, what you can expect from it, and is it finished? Spoiler alert, I'm not gonna tell you. You're gonna watch the video, goddammit. Without too many shenanigans, let's actually go into the changes real quick, because I do have a feeling that these will not be the last ones that we will see, but they are good changes. First of all, Bastion of Light has been redesigned. Your next 5 casts of Judgment will generate 2 additional holy power at the moment, meaning that each Judgment will generate 3 holy power. Overall, this adds more flexibility to the node and gives you more options in how to spend that holy power. Not to mention that you actually gain 1 extra holy power as opposed to the previous version of Bastion of Light, since the previous Bastion of Light gave you 3 free Shield of the Righteous that you probably would have wanted to use back to back, which is already a problematic playstyle, since during that time you don't really want to generate any other holy power, since you're kind of wasting it unless you're not capped yet. And you kind of want to spend these back to back to back, and you might even have some Shining Lights procs that you want to spend also free of holy power, and it kind of messes a little bit with your generating spending rotation. Implementing that mechanic and kind of the same payoff while inside your actual generators is just a much better design altogether, and you gain 10 total holy power as opposed to the 9 that you would in the previous one. Functionally, this is just way better, since just gaining holy power and then spending it freely is better than just deducting the price of the spender. And it also has been moved to the right hand side of the talent tree, and with this I do have to mention that there are a lot of talents that have been swapped in terms of their positioning, which makes slightly more sense, since we did have nodes on the right hand side that affected Avenger's Shield, and Avenger's Shield has pretty much all of its buffers to the left hand side. We'll get to those as well, because I do want to talk about Sanctuary, which was the old choice node on the left hand side of the talent tree, and now makes Consecration's benefits persist for 4 seconds after you leave it. If you have seen any of our recent Death Knight videos, you know that this has been a mechanic that they've implemented there for their Death and Decay mechanic of cleaving, and now we have the same thing for Prot Paladin. This addresses the issue of Prot Paladin requiring Consecration for a lot of damage reduction and being able to survive a lot of the damage, and being forced to move outside of Consecration to actually deal with mechanics, dodge frontals, dodge swirlies, dodge the fire, or simply just move because you have to move because that is the encounter. Being able to retain those benefits for 4 seconds after leaving Consecration is definitely really good. It still feels like a band-aid fix to an issue that's way bigger than just Consecration, which is ground effects that make you have to be stationary in a world where combat design forces you to move. Maybe the friction between properly moving when you have to do it and being able to maintain the maximum amount of value from your positioning choices is what the devs are looking for in elevating the skill cap of, or the skill ceiling rather, of certain players. And maybe that's why they're still keeping this type of mechanic inside the game. However, we do have a success story already that does away with all of this, and that is just also right here in the Paladin class, and I'm talking about Red, and how Red essentially addresses Consecration, period. Now, I understand that Consecration is probably more thematic for protection than it is for Red Paladin, so it probably doesn't have to go away, but I would like something a little bit more to feel like that I still don't have to lose too much by losing out. Although, to be fair, this version of Sanctuary is a godsend. However, this should probably be baked into the baseline functionality of Consecration and just give us a new talent, since this is a mechanical problem that we have to sort with a talent point, when we could use those talent points to augment our damage, survivability, cooldown reduction, or any other thing that Prot Paladin does really well. Another change has been made to Light of the Titans, which is now a 1-point talent tree, and it's a choice node right now with Tyrion's Devotion. Light of the Titan now also is slightly reworked, where Word of Glory heals for an additional 20% over 15 seconds instead of actually scaling with your attack power. Increased by 100% if cast on yourself while you are afflicted by a harmful damage over time effect. It's great that they're addressing a talent that I don't think it has been picked once since the Prot Paladin rework of Dragonflight, and still I don't think this will ever be picked. And while we're on this topic, the entire talent tree focus on self-healing and healing the party, which I am all for because I love that aspect of Prot Paladin, is almost dead, and it will likely still be dead. Not only because there's just not enough point economy to go into developing this part of your Prot Paladin playstyle, but also because, and I don't know if this is intentional or not, but for a month at this point, the entire healing aspect of the War Within is incredibly nerfed to the ground, and not just for tanks and DPS hybrids, but also for healers as well. I'm actually all for healing just being overall nerfed and not feeling like you can just turbo burst heal one person from 0 to 100 in 2 seconds, because that's the problem that we have right now with healing in Dragonflight. But at the same time, that means that these talents are just way more useless or way less impactful than their counterparts, making them even less of a enticing choice to be picked overall. Part of the solutions that Prot Paladin has to go through, and I do have some feedback at the end, by the way, but I do want to mention this right now, is Bulwark of Order and how it's now a one-pointer. This essentially unlocks a couple of options right now when building your Prot Paladin, since the rework isn't groundbreaking where you will probably play differently. You'll probably, with the current version of Prot Paladin, you'll play the same way in the War Within, so likely the same talents are going to be picked in Mythic Plus and Raid, since Prot Paladin has been one of the tanks with one of the most static builds ever, unless we receive like some much more impactful changes to the talents. So right now, Bulwark of Order only being 1 point could unlock different choices and options that you can pick, stuff like Fate in the Light that you could probably use in dungeons, or maybe put 1 point into the Light of the Titans versus Tyrion's Devotion choice that has been just updated, although I would be surprised if that's any better than just getting a little bit more block chance for 5 seconds, considering that with Lightsmith you'll be casting Words of Glory like a maniac. Another choice note that has been addressed was the Soaring Shield and Focused Enmity, which now have been separated. They've been split apart. They've been divorced, okay? And you can actually pick both of them right now if you so desire, which definitely addresses and helps Prot Paladin's damage profile within Mythic Plus. However, that just means you need, once again, another talent point to put into these particular talents, or into the one that you wouldn't normally pick, although it's likely that this only affects Mythic Plus, to be fair. And once again, I don't know if we have that point to spare. Crusader's Resolve has also been reworked, and it's now a choice node with Strength in Adversity all the way to the bottom left-hand side of the talent tree, just before Moment of Glory. These are usually the talents that you would pick in either Mythic Plus or Raid. Crusader's Resolve essentially is the Raid option, where now enemies hit by Avenger Shield deal 10% reduced melee damage to you for 10 seconds. You're probably gonna have 100% uptime on this. I think you can cast Avenger Shield way more often than once every 10 seconds, and having melee damage reduction added to your survivability kit is probably way better than just flat out damage reduction that can overlap that we had before, making this a stronger defensive talent, considering that the majority of the damage that you take in Raid is just pure melee damage. And even if you are on a, let's say, heavy magical damage boss, which I'm thinking it's stuff like Diurna or Rashok, even though they still have a lot of physical components to them as well, you still take the majority of the damage to your face in melee, so this is a very good change. This just makes you way tankier in raids, so yay for more buffs. Also, Strength in Adversity has been buffed as well, where now it grants 5% parry per target, up from the previous 2%. This is more in lines of tuning. We're probably going to see more of this going further into the War Within, so although these are great at the moment, it's too early to tell if overall this is what we're gonna go with within the War Within. And if you still have any questions about that, how about you come to our stream on twitch.tv/MarcelianOnline, where we chat with you guys, discuss all of the changes to all of the classes, whether they be on the alpha or on the live servers. Not only that, we also do keys and raids with you guys on the EU side at the moment, but still, it's pretty fun to actually get to chat with you guys and see exactly what you think of things and have a discussion and more in an upcoming project that we have that's kind of secret at the moment, and it's going to be live very soon, so you might as well just go to twitch.tv/MarcelianOnline now and hit that follow button and you know, get notified when we actually do enable the new cool stuff coming right at you. Almost as cool as the hero talents. Well, actually it's cooler than Templar, because Templar is the one that we're going to be looking at the moment, And all right, let me just get into it, okay? So Templar revolves around the big ability called Light's Guidance. Now, Light's Guidance affects your Eye of Tyr, meaning that you will have to have Eye of Tyr, which is not a bad thing considering that you use Eye of Tyr in pretty much every bit of content altogether. Once you cast Eye of Tyr, it transforms into Hammer of Light, which is this big fat explosion that you use. It consumes 5 holy power, by the way, and it does a lot of damage to 4 nearby enemies. This also enables the second functionality of Templar, which is Imperium Hammers. These are essentially probably more predominant than your big Templar hammer that you might be thinking about. And these little hammers just happen all across the talent tree. There are a lot of nodes that just spawn these little hammers, make them do more damage, and essentially culminate in the capstone, which is Light's Deliverance. You gain a stack of Light's Deliverance when you call down an Imperium Hammer. While Eye of Tyr and Hammer of Light are unavailable, you can consume 60 stacks of Light's Deliverance, empowering yourself to cast Hammer of Light an additional time for free. What this means is that this is a stackable buff. Once it gets to 60, if 60 is going to remain the number, your Eye of Tyr will again transform into Hammer of Light, and you can just cast it for free without having to spend that 5 holy power. Outside of all of the buffers for Imperium Hammers, which I'm not going to go into because they're fine, but they're just all passive and you don't really interact with any of them at the moment. One cool and actually probably the strongest talent that we have in the tree, ironically, is Undisputed Ruling. Hammer of Light applies Judgment to its targets and increases your haste by 15% for 6 seconds. This is already a really significant change to your rotation, to your gameplay, and 15% haste is pretty pog. Additionally, Eye of Tyr grants 3 holy power. This essentially will change your generating spending economy in terms of your rotation and holy power and how you approach this whole mechanic. It takes a little to get used to because I am guilty of casting Eye of Tyr at 4 holy power, maybe even 5 holy power, even 3 holy power, and just wasting some of this holy power because it's not something that you're used to. This will essentially make you a little bit more engaged with the hero talent tree to kind of, think a little bit. It's like, okay, I need to spend a little bit of holy power before I cast my Eye of Tyr. But also, if you cast Eye of Tyr at 2 holy power, you can immediately follow it up with a Hammer of Light, since you kind of really do want to spend it as quick as possible. And speaking of Hammer of Light, I do have to say, after playing Warlock, specifically Diabolist, the animation is a little bit lackluster as opposed to the first time that I've played this, and it's not a hammer. It's kind of like a holy flame strike that you see in terms of how it looks and how it feels. So I would probably be grateful and maybe speak on behalf of the majority of the Prot Paladins when we kind of say maybe we can make this a little bit more visually impactful, considering that Paladin as a whole class just has almost all of the other visuals way more impactful than the actual hammer that should be raining down from the sky. But that's just a little side note. Outside of that, overall Templar is fine, but it's mostly damage. Imperium Hammers are just pure damage. It has close to no synergy with you being a tank whatsoever, outside of the odd 1 or 2 utility nodes, and that's about it. As opposed to something like Lightsmith, which I have come to change my mind on, considering that I was a big simp for the Templar, but now Lightsmith is my bay, and it's a big bay right now because it has slightly been redesigned and a lot of concerns about it have been addressed, particularly in how the Holy Armaments function. Holy Armaments is essentially the mechanic of Lightsmith, where it's on a 1-minute charge. It's a new ability that you will have to put on your bars, and it will buff you if you don't have a party member selected, because you can actually select another friendly target and you can buff them. And throughout the talent tree, there are other options that make you also get the buff in return, so you're not essentially wasting it. Just to quickly go over it, Holy Armaments is a 2-pronged ability that cycles between Sacred Weapon and Holy Bulwark. And once you use one, it turns into the other. Essentially what this means is Sacred Weapon makes you wield a sacred weapon and your spells and abilities have a chance to deal additional holy damage or healing. And after you use it, it turns into Holy Bulwark. As far as the tuning goes right now, even though this is kind of relative, Sacred Weapon does quite a bit of damage and definitely feels a little bit augmentation-y in the way that you can give this to a party member and they can actually do a lot more damage. And that is actually really cool. And Holy Bulwark makes you gain a shield for 15% of your max health and an additional 5% every 2 seconds, stacking up to 30%. These are all just numbers that will get tweaked and tuned eventually. But the fact that you don't have to like cast it on the ground or have to pick it up or anything like that, and you can just cast it on other people, just makes it way easier to use and a lot less annoying. And the node that I mentioned is Solidarity, which is just following down this. If you bestow an armament upon an ally, you also gain its benefits. And if you bestow an armament upon yourself, a nearby ally also gains its benefits. After reviewing a lot of other hero talents, I feel like this is something that should probably be baked into the baseline of the ability, because it's not a choice. It's how the design is meant to be focused. Maybe we could have something a little bit more interesting instead of this, since this doesn't feel like it augments anything that you do. You're never not going to play with this. This is not a playstyle choice. This is just how it's supposed to function, but maybe that's just my opinion. Another augment to the Holy Armaments is the choice node Divine Inspiration and Forewarning. Divine Inspiration makes your spells and abilities have a chance to manifest the Holy Armament for a nearby ally. Presumably, once you do this, Solidarity will also give you that same buff, while Forewarning reduces the cooldown of Holy Armaments by 20%. This is kind of like a choice between a guaranteed uptime and an RNG uptime. This is, at the end of the day, pure uptime. This will probably have to be simmed to figure out exactly which one gives you more uptime. If it's more or less the same, then it probably is actually a playstyle choice of whether or not you want this RNG and you don't have to worry about it, or you can just manually cast it more often. Either way, the gameplay implications will be important, and we'll get to that in a second, because I want to talk about the capstone just to kind of give you a better sense of what Holy Armaments are about. Blessing of the Forge is what the capstone is called, and Avenging Wrath summons an additional sacred weapon. And during Avenging Wrath, your sacred weapon casts spells on your target and echoes the effects of your holy power spenders. This is a little bit hard to tell at the moment right now in alpha with limited testing and actual data behind the scenes without logs and stuff like that. I know people can do logs. I'm a little bit too dumb to do those logs, and I will wait the better brains of the Hammer of Wrath Discord to actually figure out exactly what this does, because it sounds cool in practice, but as with many things in World of Warcraft, it's hard to tell how good it is and what it actually does without actually popping the hood and looking underneath into the data of World of Warcraft, which is probably a problem with the current design. But it's not that big of a deal. It's good. You just get more weapons, and everything that the talent tree does just expands more, and we get to actually the cool bits of the talent tree, starting with laying down arms. When an armament fades from you, the cooldown of lay on hands is reduced by 15 seconds, and you gain Shining Light or Infusion of Light. You actually get quite a few Shining Lights, and you do have the cycle of armaments quite often, particularly if you just use wings. You get the RNG procs, or you just have a lower cooldown on the Holy Armaments, but the additional Shining Light proc definitely helps. I do have to say that after playing with it a little bit, if the fight lasts long enough, you will run out of mana. Maybe this is something that needs to be taken into consideration, because on raid fights, on bosses like Farok, maybe even Razageth, long bosses, you'll probably run out of mana by the time you get to the last phase of the encounter if you press this on cooldown, and you will want to press this on cooldown because you have talents like Valiance or Valiance. Valiance? That sounds better. Consuming Shining Light will reduce the cooldown of Holy Armaments by 3 seconds, so this will overall increase the uptime on this, so you will want to use every bit of Shining Light that you will have to be able to guarantee that you increase the uptime on the Holy Armament. And considering that we've had talent changes, stuff like Bastion of Light, that just gives you an influx of holy power to spend, getting you those Shining Light procs even quicker, once again, we talk about the mana issue. However, this is just a fun gameplay loop that just pops you with some procs in the middle of your rotation. It's still healing, it's still kind of small in terms of the overall, but you do cast it a lot, so that kind of makes up for it a little bit. Another thing that I wanted to talk about that hasn't actually been addressed, and we did talk about this in the dev interview that we had with the Lightsmith, and maybe they're fine with the way it is now, but that's particularly regarding the Rites talents, the Rite of Sanctification or Rite of Adjuration, which are basically rune forges. If you have played Death Knight, it's basically a weapon enchant. Rite of Sanctification imbues your weapon with Power of the Light, increasing your armor by 5% and your primary stat by 1%, while Rite of Adjuration imbues your weapon with the Power of Light, increasing your stamina by 3% and causing your holy power spenders to sometimes unleash a burst of healing around your target. Now, whether or not that healing is good is besides the point, because the discussion is something a little bit more fundamental to WoW's stat and player power design, and that is that primary stat will always prevail over stuff like stamina, because first of all, primary stat is throughput. You do more damage, and a lot of stuff is scaling with your strength, stuff like Holy Word or healing through different abilities, period, as opposed to just having a little bit more HP or just proccing those heals altogether. Armor is kind of not here nor there. You have a lot of points in your talent trees, whether it is class or spec, that give you little tiny bits of armor, so it's not a big change, but the primary side will likely still win in the end unless the stamina buff is a lot more significant. I'm not even sure if 5% stamina is enough to trump 1% strength. And this is something that maybe the devs want to take into consideration, because as far as competence goes, you will always want primary stat, especially as a tank, since it also gives you defensives. Other than this, there are just some other okay-ish damage nodes across the board, not a big deal, and some also oriented towards PvP, but at the end of the day, this is just a way better version of a hero talent as opposed to Templar. Overall, after looking at the changes for Prot Paladin and playing it in the alpha right now, and looking what it's going to be competing against in terms of design and hero talents and options and things like that, it's a little bit lackluster. First of all, Lightsmith just beats Templar out of the water, undisputed champion in terms of design and actual effect and what it gives to you as a player, and the talent tree is still incredibly restrictive, assuming that we won't have any more changes. What we've received so far is good, but it's just not enough. We will need something like what Demonology just recently received. We need probably either more 1-point nodes or pretty much all 2-pointers just become 1-pointers. Maybe limit the amount of capstones that we can get, or the way that we can get to the capstones if we end up doing that. Or something else that could be done is to reduce the number of defensive talents and make them stronger to leave room for other talents to be picked. Talents like the healing or throughput or survivability talents in terms of lay on hands or words of glory or helping your party or things like that, which are almost dead talents at this point. And we can say the same thing about the damage talents. The competition between cooldown reduction, parry gains, block gains, DPS will just make a lot of the current dead talents even deader. Talents like Light of the Titans, even though it was changed, Tyrion's Devotion, Seal of Charity, Uther's Counsel, even Moment of Glory most likely will probably not get picked whatsoever. And part of the issue are also the capstones at the moment. Looking at how capstones have been addressed for other specs, it's very clear that the current capstones are close to being mandatory for Protection Paladin. Righteous Protector is something that as a tank you will never not play without, since the cooldown reduction on your defensives is something that helps you actually push content, and that's usually the barrier that current tanks will face. In most light, just makes Eye of Tyr an almost mandatory ability for Paladin period, but definitely mandatory for Templar. A steal, since Eye of Tyr just provides 25% damage reduction, and you get 25% cooldown reduction on that 25% damage reduction. It's very hard to beat in terms of an actual capstone. Final Stand is a unique thing that Prot Paladin does, and it puts it in a bucket of its own that no other tank can do. It's a fantasy and flavor that should not go away, but will most likely make it mandatory for Mythic Plus if it is very accessible. Righteous Fury as well is just an easy way to access damage that pretty much all tanks get in one way or another if they can actually get to it, particularly in AoE and Mythic Plus, since the competition with the DPS throughput is very high, so you don't really want to kind of lose aggro or anything of the sorts. And because these are so impactful for the functionality of Protection Paladin, them being capstone makes it a problem designing the rest of the talent tree, since you don't want to lower the number of talents that have 2 points investment, because that will just mean you will get all of the capstones and then there's like no choice whatsoever. So maybe have these moved a little bit around through the talent tree, kind of like how they might have been in the past, and put other sorts of barriers to get them so you don't degenerately just pick all of the capstones in the talent tree. Prot Paladin is actually on its way to becoming a lot better if they keep iterating on this, and I'm sure that there are much smarter people providing feedback to turn Prot Paladin into a giga turbo awesome spec like what Frost Decay is. Even if Frost Decay is not a tank, the way it's addressing its talent design is just way interesting and way cooler. They can learn something about this, and you should actually check what Frost Decay has going for it, because it's a much better spec. After 3 expansions, it's turning into a modern World of Warcraft spec.